The story of Moses and the Exodus is very interesting. It's interesting not just because it's kind of the most important story in the Old Testament. It's not just interesting because Moses is really, he's a very reluctant messenger, as we read a little bit of in our thing today. But it's also important because it shows yet again what God is all about. And I'm going to have to use some words to talk about this that are words that they've become politicized, but they're not political words. They've just turned into words that people use in political contexts, which is very unfortunate because they're very good words. Here's the thing. God is all about having people with privilege help those who do not. Now, this is very clear in the story of the Exodus, especially when you remember who Moses is. Because Moses grew up with a great deal of privilege. Now, when we met Moses today, we wouldn't think that. We would think that he was just a dude hanging out in the wilderness and happened upon a burning bush one day. But you have to remember the story of how Moses was born. Because when Moses was born, it was at a time when the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, had decided that all Israelite males should be killed at birth. I had to clarify that. So anytime a child is born in Israel to the Israelite slaves and it was a male child, that child was supposed to be killed. Now, many obeyed this law, many didn't, but one family in particular tried to hide their child for a pretty good amount of time until it got to the point where they couldn't do it anymore. And they made a basket, they shipped it down the Nile. And that basket happened to float down the Nile a little ways, floated down the Nile a little ways more, and ended up running into the daughter of the Pharaoh while she was having a bath. And the daughter of the Pharaoh said, "Oh, there's a baby in this basket. I wonder where it came from." And someone said, "Oh, it looks like one of those Israelite babies." And she said, "Oh, mine now." And she adopted this child. Now, some really cool stuff happened where Moses, who this baby, of course, is, Moses' sister ended up following the basket down the Nile. She happened upon Pharaoh's daughter when she found the kid, and the sister goes, "Oh, I know someone who'd make a great wet nurse for this one," and the wet nurse happened to be Moses' actual mother. But Moses grew up as the grandson of the king of Egypt. It's easy to forget that when you think of Moses wandering around the wilderness, but that's kind of a big deal. To be the the grandson of the king of Egypt is a big deal. And so Moses grew up in Pharaoh's house. He grew up as a prince. He was legally royalty. But then one day, Moses decided that he was going to go for a walk and find some things out about his origins, find some things out about his people, the Israelites, and he happens upon an Egyptian foreman beating one of the Israelite slaves. And after confronting the Egyptian, Moses ends up killing him. He tried to cover up his crime, but he could not, and when his grandfather found out about it, he wasn't too happy. So Moses ended up fleeing into the wilderness where he ended up meeting his future wife and future father-in-law and all of that. Now, it's interesting to note when he flees into the desert and ends up in Midian, not a single soul says, "Hey, there's a Hebrew over there." They all say, "Hey, there's an Egyptian." Moses looks like an Egyptian. He acts like an Egyptian because he grew up like an Egyptian in the royal house. So during the time of Moses' self-imposed exile, his uncle succeeds his father, or his uncle becomes Pharaoh. Let's just go with that. And the Israelites start crying out to God for salvation. They're crying out for God to free them from their slavery. And so one day Moses is wandering around in the desert. And he looks, and he sees a bush on fire. Now that's not weird. Bushes would catch fire all the time. The problem was that the bush kept being on fire. And Moses said, that's weird. So he went to go check it out. And he meets God. And they have a 2-chapter long conversation that goes something like this. You're going to get my people out of Egypt. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, you're not. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Seriously, dude, you are. Get over it already. That's the conversation. It's like arguing with a 2-year-old. No, actually, I think a 2-year-old listens better than Moses did. So Moses really didn't want to do this, and I think it's because he was still afraid that he was going to be in trouble for killing that dude forever ago. But Moses was uniquely suited to be the one to get God's people out of Egypt because he had privilege. He was the nephew of the Pharaoh. So he could walk right into the palace and say, hey, I want to talk to my uncle. Uncle Ramses, let's say his name is. I don't think it was Ramses, it might have been, but we'll call him Uncle Ramses. I want to talk to Uncle Ram, and everyone would be like, oh, Moses, you're back. Let me take you to Uncle Ram. Who else could have done that but someone who grew up in the Egyptian royal household? But then he could also, because he was an Israelite, he could go and talk to the Israelites. He could go between these two people groups, and you see him doing that in the book of Exodus. He talks to the Israelites. They say, who do you think you are? He says, well, I'm the one that God's going to use to get you out of Egypt, and they all laugh. Then he goes and talks to Pharaoh and says, hey, my God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, yeah, sure he does. But even when Pharaoh's mad at him, he can still go in and talk to Pharaoh. It's kind of crazy. So Moses is able to do this because of the accident that led to him being raised in Pharaoh's household. And God uses him to get the Israelites out of slavery and into the doorstep of the promised land. Moses' temper gets to him after a little while and he can't quite go in, but Moses gets him most of the way there. And because of his privilege, he could stand before Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And he used that to free people who could not speak for themselves. And that's the important part there. This is something that God does all the time. This bringing the slaves out of Egypt became the identifying feature of God. Over and over again, how often does God say, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt? Then in Matthew 25, Jesus brings this up a little bit again when he says, whatever you did and didn't do for the least of these, you did or didn't do to me. The entire Gospel of Luke is all about how the people who are of low station will become of high station, the people of high station will become of low station. It's called the Great Reversal. God doesn't just root for the underdog is his favorite. So what does that mean for us today? We live in a world where the division between the privileged and those who are not privileged is getting bigger, not smaller. And we're living in a world where when the least stands up and says that there is a problem here, those who are not the least say, no, there's not, shut up. But that is not the way of God. The way of God is to stand up for those people that are saying there is a problem here, and for us to stand with them. Because in our world, most of us in these pews, are privileged. Because of our birth, we don't have to worry about getting pulled over and having to prove that we're citizens. If we get accused of a crime, we're more likely to be presented well in the newspaper. And speaking of the newspaper or TV, we can look on television and we see people who look like us all the time. Imagine if Moses, instead of standing up for the Israelites, said to himself, Egypt's got it right. The Israelites should just accept that they're slaves and let things just be how they are. Everything's fine. They're getting food. They're getting water. They're okay. Sure, they have to work a little bit, but who doesn't have to work for their food? He could have married a nice Egyptian girl. Wouldn't have had to deal with the whole 40 years in the wilderness thing. If he'd have just been nice and comfortable and told himself that nothing was wrong. But that's not how things went down. That's not what Moses did. Moses said, no. God's calling me to do this, and after a whole lot of convincing, he said, yes, I'm going to go to Egypt and get God's people out of there. He stood up for someone who he could have easily ignored. And God used him to free the entire population of Israel. This is the example that God has for us. When he says who he is, that he is the God who brought the Israelites out of Egypt, will we answer his call to bring those who have no voice out of their oppression? Do we listen to the stories of those who experience this every day? Do we listen to the stories of racism, sexism, homophobia, and so many other examples of discrimination? Do we hear their stories and act on them, or do we just sit there and ignore the problems that they are saying that we're experiencing? Because that's what's before us. When we see the least, what do? Do we see them and help them, and then helping them help Jesus? Or do we ignore them and ignore Jesus? God challenges all of us to follow the example of Moses and stand for those with no standing, and be the hands and feet of the God who has been and will always be the one who brings people out of slavery, out of oppression, out of bondage, and into a new life. Because our God has always been for the least of these. I think we ought to be as well.